The morning of March 3rd, 1943, Bismarck Sea, north of New Guinea. From the cockpit of his B-25 Mitchell, Major Ed Larner could see the Japanese convoy stretched across the water below, 8 destroyers and 7 transport ships carrying nearly 7,000 troops toward Leh. The convoy had been at sea for 3 days, and in less than an hour they would reach the safety of harbour. What the Japanese sailors did not know, as they scanned the horizon for enemy aircraft, was that the rules of engagement were about to change. What the destroyer captains did not understand, as they trained their anti-aircraft guns skyward, was that their medium-altitude defence doctrine had just become obsolete. And what the transport commanders could not have anticipated was that the lumbering medium bombers approaching from the north had been transformed into something the Imperial Japanese Navy had never encountered before. The B-25 Mitchell was a medium bomber. Everyone knew this. The aircraft had been designed to carry bombs to medium-altitude targets and return safely to base. Its transparent nose housed a bombardier, its bomb bay carried conventional ordnance, and its defensive armament consisted of turret-mounted guns to ward off enemy fighters. This was the doctrine. This was what every Air Force manual specified. This was what every tactical officer had been taught. But doctrine, like steel, can be reshaped under pressure, and in the Southwest Pacific Theater during the winter of 1942 and 43, the pressure had become unbearable. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The B-25 approaching the Japanese convoy that morning was not the aircraft North American Aviation had delivered. Its transparent nose had been replaced with solid metal. Where the bombardier's station had been, 850 caliber Browning M2 machine guns now protruded, aimed directly forward. 4 additional guns had been mounted in external pods on the fuselage sides, just below the cockpit. When Major Larner pressed the firing button, 14 heavy machine guns would fire simultaneously, pouring more than 200 pounds of lead per second into whatever lay ahead. The Japanese convoy maintained its formation. The destroyers assumed their defensive positions. The anti-aircraft crews prepared for the medium-altitude bombing runs they had successfully defended against for months. They were ready for conventional tactics. They were prepared for standard doctrine. They were expecting the war they knew how to fight. To understand what happened in the Bismarck Sea that morning, one must first understand the problem that had plagued Allied commanders for nearly 2 years. The problem was simple to state, but extraordinarily difficult to solve. How do you sink ships from the air? This question had consumed military strategists since the First World War. The theoretical answer seemed obvious. Drop bombs on ships, watch them sink. But the practical reality proved far more complex. A ship at sea is not a stationary target. A competent captain, observing bombers at altitude, has precious seconds to alter course. A bomb dropped from 10,000 feet takes approximately 23 seconds to reach the water. In 23 seconds, a destroyer travelling at 30 knots covers more than 300 yards. The bomb, once released, cannot change course. The ship can. By the winter of 1943, American and Australian air forces had conducted hundreds of attacks on Japanese shipping. The results were dispiriting. Heavy bombers flying at medium altitude scored occasional hits through sheer volume of ordnance, but the expenditure of bombs per ship sunk was astronomical. Light bombers attempting low-altitude attacks were shredded by anti-aircraft fire before reaching their targets. Torpedo bombers, slow and vulnerable, suffered catastrophic losses. The Japanese shipping lanes remained open. The statistics told the story. In the 6 months between July 1942 and January 1943, Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific conducted more than 200 missions against Japanese convoys. They sank fewer than 10% of the targeted vessels. The Japanese, emboldened by these survival rates, increased their convoy operations. Supplies and reinforcements flowed steadily to Japanese garrisons throughout New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. The Allied ground offensive stalled for lack of air superiority over sea lanes. Lieutenant General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific, understood the mathematics of failure. His B-17 flying fortresses could drop tons of bombs on a convoy and sink perhaps one transport. His A-20 Havocs attempting mast-level attacks were shot down at unsustainable rates. His torpedo-equipped aircraft rarely survived long enough to launch. The doctrine was clear. The doctrine was failing. Something had to change. The Japanese convoy doctrine, meanwhile, had evolved into a sophisticated defensive system. Destroyers formed protective rings around transport ships. Anti-aircraft crews trained constantly on medium-altitude targets. Fighter cover, when available, focused on intercepting high-flying bombers. The system worked because it countered established Allied tactics. American bombers attacked from altitude, Japanese destroyers defended against altitude attacks, and the balance favored survival. In January 1943, the Japanese had tested this system with a convoy carrying the 102nd Infantry Regiment from Rabaul to Leh. Allied aircraft attacked repeatedly. 2 transports were sunk, but 3/4 of the regiment reached shore safely. The Japanese commanders noted the losses, judged them acceptable, and began planning a much larger convoy for March. Nearly 7,000 troops, 8 transport ships, 8 destroyer escorts, 100 fighter aircraft providing air cover. If the January convoy had been acceptable, this March convoy would be overwhelming. What the Japanese did not know was that while they were planning their March convoy, a 43-year-old former Navy Chief Petty Officer named Paul Irvin Gunn was solving General Kenny's problem in a maintenance hangar at Eagle Farm Airfield in Brisbane, Australia. Paul Gunn was not supposed to be revolutionizing aerial warfare. He was supposed to be flying transport missions. When the war began, Captain Gunn commanded an improvised transport squadron in the Philippines, flying unarmed civilian aircraft to deliver supplies to American forces on Bataan. When Manila fell to the Japanese in January 1942, Gunn's wife and 4 children were captured and interned. Gunn himself escaped to Australia with a personal vendetta and 21 years of aviation experience. His background was unusual for an Army Air Forces officer. He had enlisted in the Navy in 1918 and served as an aviation mechanic while teaching himself to fly. By 1923, he had been selected as an enlisted naval aviation pilot, one of the Navy's so-called flying chiefs. He flew from the carrier Langley, served with Fighting Squadron 2, worked as a flight instructor at Pensacola, and retired as a Chief Petty Officer in December 1939 after 21 years of service. When war came, he was running Philippine Airlines with a fleet of civilian Beech aircraft. This combination of experiences made Gunn uniquely qualified to solve problems that defeated conventional engineering. He understood metal, electricity, hydraulics, and armament from years as a mechanic. He understood flight characteristics and combat tactics from years as a pilot. He understood improvisation from years working with whatever resources were available. And he understood urgency from the knowledge that his family was imprisoned in Manila. In August 1942, Gunn approached the 3rd Attack Group with a proposal. The A-20 Havoc light bomber carried 4 .30-caliber machine guns in its nose compartment. These guns, fired by the bombardier, were flexible mounts designed for defense. Gunn proposed removing the transparent nose entirely and installing fixed 50-caliber Browning machine guns aimed directly forward. The pilot would control all guns, firing them simultaneously while approaching a target at low altitude. The concentrated firepower would suppress anti-aircraft positions, allowing the bomber to survive long enough to release its ordnance. The modification required solving multiple technical problems. The transparent nose had to be replaced with a solid metal structure strong enough to mount 4 heavy machine guns. Ammunition feeds had to be engineered. Firing controls had to be installed in the cockpit. The aircraft's center of gravity had to be recalculated. Weight and balance had to be maintained. And all of this had to be accomplished without access to factory engineering support, without proper machine tools, and without official authorization. Gunn, assisted by First Lieutenant Tom Tompkins and working in a maintenance facility that lacked even basic equipment, completed the first A-20 Strafer conversion by the end of August 1942. The aircraft was tested on September 12, with an attack on a Japanese airfield at Buna. The results exceeded expectations. The forward-firing guns cleared Japanese positions. The bomber survived. The target was destroyed. General Kenny saw the test results and immediately recognized what Gunn had created. This was not simply an improved bomber. This was a different weapon system. Kenny ordered 16 more, 20 conversions, and assigned Gunn as his special projects officer with instructions to develop similar modifications for the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber. The B-25, larger than the A-20, could carry more guns, more ammunition, and more bombs. If Gunn could transform the Mitchell into a Strafer, Kenny would have a weapon capable of destroying Japanese shipping. The engineering challenge was substantial. The B-25 weighed 33,000 pounds fully loaded. Adding 8 50 caliber machine guns, 4 external gun pods, ammunition systems, and structural reinforcement would alter the aircraft's handling characteristics significantly. North American Aviation, the manufacturer, had never designed the Mitchell for this configuration. No engineering data existed. No wind tunnel tests had been conducted. No factory support was available. Gunn worked through November and December 1942, fabricating parts, testing installations, and modifying B-25 seconds in a converted hangar space. He stripped 50 caliber guns from damaged fighter aircraft. He designed mounting systems using whatever materials were available. He created ammunition feed mechanisms that factory engineers would have considered impossible. By February 1943, one complete squadron of B-25 Strafers was operational with the 91st Bombardment Squadron. The timing was precise. On February 28, 1943, the Japanese convoy departed Simpson Harbor at Rabaul, heading south toward Leh. Allied codebreakers had already decrypted the convoy's schedule, route, and destination. General Kenny had already assembled his strike force, and Major Ed Larner had already trained his crews on the new attack profile. Low-altitude approach, maximum speed, forward guns firing to suppress defenses, skip bombs released at mast height. The doctrine had changed, but the Japanese convoy, steaming south through the Bismarck Sea, would not learn this until March 3rd, when it was far too late to matter. The 91st Bombardment Squadron, commanded by Major Ed Larner, had spent the final weeks of February 1943 practicing techniques that conventional wisdom considered suicidal. Their training ground was the wreck of the SS Pruth, a 4,700-ton steamer that had run aground on Natiara Reef near Port Moresby during a storm in January 1924. For nearly 2 decades, the rusted hulk had sat on the reef as a navigation hazard. Now it served as target practice for crews learning to attack ships at altitudes that made survival questionable. The skip bombing technique required precision that bordered on the impossible. Pilots approached the target at 200 to 250 feet above the water, flying at speeds between 200 and 250 miles per hour. At approximately 300 yards from the target, the pilot released a stick of 2 to 4 bombs, typically 500-pound or 1,000-pound ordnance equipped with 4 to 5 second delay fuses. The bombs, rather than falling vertically, would skip across the water surface like flat stones, bouncing once or twice before striking the ship's hull at or below the waterline. The mathematics were unforgiving. At 200 miles per hour, the bomber covered 93 yards per second. The pilot had approximately 3 seconds between bomb release and passing over the target ship. In those 3 seconds, the bombs had to skip across the water and strike the hull with sufficient force to penetrate or detonate alongside. Release too early, and the bombs skipped past the target. Release too late and they fell short, or struck the water at the wrong angle, diving beneath the surface without skipping at all. Mast height bombing was even more demanding. The bomber would approach at 200 to 500 feet, then descend to mast height, 10 to 15 feet above the water, at approximately 600 yards from the target. At 300 yards, flying at 265 miles per hour, the pilot released bombs aimed directly at the ship's side. The aircraft then pulled up sharply to clear the target's superstructure. Many pilots combined both techniques, skipping the first bomb and releasing the second at mast height. During practice runs against the Pruth, 2 aircraft were damaged by flying debris from their own bomb blasts. A third crashed after colliding with the wreck's mast during a too low approach. These were not simulated dangers. These were the actual risks crews would face when attacking Japanese destroyers equipped with 5-inch guns and multiple anti-aircraft batteries. The low altitude eliminated the safety margin. The direct approach toward the target eliminated evasive maneuvering. Survival depended entirely on suppressing enemy fire before it destroyed the attacking bomber. This was where Pappy guns' Strafer modifications proved essential. The B-25's forward-firing armament consisted of 8 50-caliber Browning M, 2 machine guns mounted in the solid nose, plus 4 additional guns in external pods flanking the cockpit. Each gun fired at approximately 800 rounds per minute. With 14 guns firing simultaneously, the bomber delivered approximately 187 rounds per second, or more than 200 pounds of lead. The 50-caliber Browning M2 was not a small-arms weapon. Each round measured 5.5 inches in length and weighed approximately 4 ounces. The projectile itself was a half-inch diameter slug weighing between 660 and 710 grains, depending on type. Muzzle velocity exceeded 2,800 feet per second. At close range, these rounds could penetrate half an inch of armor plate, destroy light gun positions, shred personnel, and tear through wooden deck planking. When Major Lana triggered his forward guns during a strafing run, the concentrated stream of fire swept across the target ship's deck from bow to stern. Positions were killed or wounded instantly. Bridge windows shattered. Wooden structures splintered. Light gun mounts were destroyed. The ship's ability to defend itself was suppressed long enough for the bomber to release its ordnance and escape. The Japanese convoy that departed Rabaul on February 28 consisted of 16 vessels. 8 were transport ships: Kyokusei Maru, Ayo Maru, Teiyo Maru, Nojima Maru, Kembu Maru, Oigawa Maru, Shin-ai Maru, and Taimei Maru. These transports carried the 51st Infantry Division headquarters and approximately 6,900 troops, along with ammunition, fuel, and supplies. 8 destroyers provided escort: Shikinami, Uranami, Shirayuki, Asashio, Arashio, Yukikaze, Tokitsukaze, and Asagumo. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura commanded the escort force from the destroyer Shirayuki. The Japanese estimated losses at 4 transports out of 10 and 30 to 40 aircraft. They gave the operation a 50% chance of success. These estimates were based on previous convoy operations, in which Allied air attacks had achieved limited results. The January convoy to Leh had lost 2 transports but delivered 3/4 of its troops safely. Japanese commanders judged these casualties acceptable given the strategic necessity of reinforcing New Guinea garrisons. What they did not know was that the Allied tactics had fundamentally changed since January. Allied codebreakers in Melbourne and Washington had decrypted Japanese naval messages detailing the convoy's composition, route, schedule, and destination. General Kenny knew exactly when and where the Japanese would be vulnerable. He assembled his strike force accordingly. 16 squadrons participated in the coordinated attack: B-17 heavy bombers from the 43rd and 19th Bomb Groups, B-25 medium bombers from the 3rd Bomb Group, A-20 light bombers from the 3rd Bomb Group, Australian bow fighters from No. 30 Squadron, P-38 fighters from the 35th and 49th Fighter Groups, and B-24 heavy bombers for reconnaissance. The attack plan called for multiple waves at different altitudes. B-17 seconds would strike first from medium altitude to scatter the convoy and force the destroyers to concentrate their anti-aircraft fire upward. Australian bow fighters would then attack at mast level to suppress deck guns and kill exposed crew members. Finally, the B-25 strafers would make their skip bombing runs while the Japanese defences were overwhelmed. The plan depended on timing, coordination, and the untested assumption that the modified bombers could survive long enough to deliver their ordnance. On the night of March 2nd to 3rd, RAAF Catalina flying boats shadowed the convoy, reporting position and course every hour. The Japanese, aware they were being tracked, maintained course toward Leh. By dawn on March 3rd, the convoy was within range of every Allied bomber squadron in Papua. The morning of March 3rd, 1943, broke clear over the Bismarck Sea. After 3 days of storm clouds and rain that had provided some concealment, the Japanese convoy steamed south through the Huon Gulf under perfect visibility. The weather that had protected them was gone. They were 60 miles from Leh. They were also completely exposed. At 9:30 in the morning, Allied aircraft began assembling over Cape Ward Hunt, 90 aircraft in total. Major Lana received the attack order at 8:55. He shouted to his squadron, "Cape Ward Hunt, 9:30, let's go." Within minutes, 12 B-25 Strafers were airborne, forming up with 13 B-17 seconds, 13 B-24 seconds, 13 Beaufighters, and escort fighters. The largest coordinated airstrike yet attempted in the Southwest Pacific was underway. The Japanese convoy maintained defensive formation. Destroyers formed a protective ring around the transports. Anti-aircraft crews stood ready at their stations. Fighter cover from Leh was expected shortly. Standard doctrine called for medium-altitude attacks, which the destroyers had successfully defended against for months. The convoy commanders had no reason to believe this attack would differ from previous engagements. At 10 o'clock, the first wave of B-17 seconds appeared at medium altitude. The destroyers immediately opened fire with their 5-inch main batteries, throwing up a curtain of anti-aircraft shells. The B-17 seconds released their bombs from 6,000 feet. Several transports were hit. The Kyokusei Maru began burning. The convoy scattered, breaking formation to evade the falling bombs. This was precisely what General Kenny's plan required. With the convoy dispersed and destroyer guns firing upward, the Australian Beaufighters dove to mast height. Flight Lieutenant R.F. Uren led No. 30 Squadron in a strafing attack that swept across the scattered ships. The Beaufighters carried 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns. At close range, their combined firepower devastated exposed personnel and equipment. Bridge crews died at their posts. Gun crews were killed before they could traverse their weapons. The carefully coordinated Japanese defense began to collapse. Then Major Lana's B-25 seconds arrived at wavetop height. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What happened next was recorded in after-action reports, combat camera footage, and the testimony of survivors on both sides. The B-25 strafers came in low and fast, approaching the scattered transports from multiple angles. At 300 yards, pilots pressed the firing buttons for their forward guns. 14 50-caliber machine guns per aircraft opened fire simultaneously. The effect was unlike anything the Japanese had encountered. The concentrated fire swept across the transport decks like a scythe. Wooden planking splintered. Metal structures buckled. Personnel, caught in the open, were cut down instantly. The streams of tracers created visible lines between the bombers and their targets, paths of destruction that lasted only seconds, but inflicted catastrophic damage. One B-25 pilot later described the scene. You'd watch the deck of the ship kind of disintegrate, little sticks, maybe a foot long or something like that, or splinters flying up off the deck. They'd fly all around. These little sticks were pieces of men. The 50-caliber rounds didn't wound. They dismembered. At 200 yards, with deck defenses suppressed, the pilots released their bombs. The skip bombing technique worked exactly as practiced. 500-pound bombs struck the water, bounced once or twice, and slammed into the transport hulls at the waterline. The delayed fuses gave the bombs time to penetrate before detonating. Explosions tore through engine rooms and cargo holds. Ships that had survived months of conventional bombing attacks were mortally wounded in seconds. The Teo Maru took multiple hits. The Io Maru began listing. The Nojima Maru exploded. The Kembu Maru broke apart. One after another, the transports that had seemed so close to safety began sinking. The destroyers, designed to fight other warships, found themselves helpless against aircraft attacking from altitudes where their main guns could not depress low enough to engage. Garrett Middlebrook, flying as a co-pilot in one of the B-25 seconds, watched from a mile away as the strafers made their runs. They went in and hit this troop ship. What I saw looked like little sticks, maybe a foot long or something like that, or splinters flying up off the deck of the ship. They'd fly all around. He understood he was witnessing something unprecedented. We knew this was a big show that would live in the history books for 100 years. The attack lasted 15 minutes. By 10:15, all 7 remaining transports had been hit. 3 were already sinking. The others were burning or dead in the water. 3 destroyer escorts had been badly damaged. 1, the Shirayuki, was sinking with Admiral Kimura still aboard. The Japanese fighter cover from Leh arrived too late to affect the outcome. The P-38 escorts engaged them while the bombers completed their runs and turned for home. The Japanese convoy, which had seemed invincible under its protective ring of destroyers and fighter cover, had been destroyed in the time it takes to eat lunch. The doctrine that had governed naval convoy operations for decades had been rendered obsolete in a quarter of an hour. The medium bombers, dismissed as ineffective against ships, had just sunk an entire convoy without losing a single aircraft to enemy fire. The afternoon of March 3rd saw the destruction completed. Additional waves of B-25 seconds and A-20 seconds attacked the crippled ships. The few vessels still capable of maneuvering attempted to reach shore or make for open water. None escaped. The destroyer Arashio was sunk during the afternoon attacks. The remaining destroyers attempted to rescue survivors but came under continuous attack themselves. By nightfall, 8 transport ships and 4 destroyers had been sunk. More than 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were dead. Approximately 5,000 survivors clung to wreckage or struggled in the water. The destroyers that remained afloat attempted rescue operations under cover of darkness, but they could not approach the survivors during daylight without becoming targets themselves. On March 4th, Allied aircraft returned to patrol the debris field. PT boats from Lieutenant Commander Barry Atkins' squadron hunted for vessels attempting rescue operations. The orders were explicit: prevent any survivors from reaching shore where they could reinforce Japanese garrisons. This task proved psychologically devastating for many Allied aircrew. They understood the strategic necessity but found the execution horrific. They strafed lifeboats, rafts, and swimmers. They attacked small craft attempting rescue. They did what total war required, and many would carry the memory for the rest of their lives. Of the 6,900 Japanese troops who had departed Rabaul bound for Leh, fewer than 1,200 reached their destination. The destroyers eventually rescued approximately 2,700 and returned them to Rabaul. More than 3,000 died in the battle or drowned in its aftermath. The 51st Infantry Division, critically needed to defend New Guinea, had been effectively destroyed before ever reaching the battlefield. The Allied losses stood in stark contrast. 4 aircraft shot down, 13 aircrew killed or missing, 12 wounded. Not a single bomber was lost to enemy fire during the main attack on March 3rd. The exchange ratio was approximately 230 Japanese casualties for every Allied casualty. This was not attrition. This was annihilation. General Douglas MacArthur, briefed on the results, called the Battle of the Bismarck Sea the decisive aerial engagement of the war in the Southwest Pacific. He was not engaging in hyperbole. The Japanese never again attempted to send a large convoy through waters controlled by Allied aircraft. Future reinforcements to New Guinea came via submarine or small boats operating at night, delivering only fractions of the troops and supplies needed. The Allied offensive in New Guinea, stalled for lack of air superiority over sea lanes, could now proceed. In North American Aviation's factory in Kansas City, engineers received reports of the battle with a mixture of vindication and shock. They had declared Pappy guns' modifications unflyable. They had insisted the forward gun package would unbalance the aircraft. They had argued that field modifications could not match factory specifications. General Kenney, attending a conference in Washington, had personally informed them that 60 B-25 Strafers were already operational and had just destroyed an entire Japanese convoy. The engineers returned to California. Major Gunn was sent from Australia to North American Aviation's plant to supervise production implementation of his modifications. The B-25G variant, incorporating the strafer nose as a factory option, entered production. The B-25H followed with even heavier armament. By war's end, several versions of the Strafer Mitchell were operational, some mounting as many as 18 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. The psychological impact on Japanese naval operations was profound. Prior to the Bismarck Sea, convoy operations had been considered acceptable risk. Losses occurred, but enough ships reached their destinations to justify the operations. After March 3rd, the calculus changed. A convoy escorted by 8 destroyers and covered by 100 fighters had been destroyed with ease. If such protection proved inadequate, no convoy was safe. The Imperial Japanese Navy, already stretched thin across the Pacific, could not afford to lose ships at this rate. Convoy operations in the Southwest Pacific essentially ceased. The weapon that accomplished this transformation was not technologically sophisticated. Pappy Gunn had not invented new engines or exotic armament. He had simply mounted existing machine guns in a different configuration and combined them with a low-altitude bombing technique that anyone with sufficient courage could learn. The innovation was tactical rather than technological, but the tactical shift was so fundamental that it changed the strategic situation across an entire theatre of war. The Luftwaffe, fighting on the other side of the world, took notice. German intelligence reports on the Bismarck Sea battle emphasized the effectiveness of low-level strafer attacks against shipping, but the Germans never fully implemented similar modifications to their medium bombers. They remained committed to conventional medium-altitude bombing and specialized anti-shipping aircraft like the Heinkel He-111 torpedo bomber. They laughed at the American tactic of converting bombers into strafers. They considered it crude, unsophisticated, and wasteful of aircraft designed for other purposes. They were wrong, and their merchant shipping in the Mediterranean would soon discover how wrong they were. But that understanding came too late, as so many German tactical insights did. The Americans, unconcerned with elegance or doctrine, had solved the shipping problem with brute force, overwhelming firepower, and pilots willing to fly into hell at 200 feet. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea proved that 14 50-caliber machine guns, properly employed, could accomplish what years of conventional bombing had failed to achieve. The lesson was simple. Sometimes the solution to an impossible problem is to change what impossible means. The Japanese had considered large convoys safe behind destroyer escorts. The B-25 strafers had erased that assumption, and with it, they had erased Japan's ability to hold New Guinea. In April 1943, Major Paul Gunn received orders he did not want. General Kenny was sending him back to the United States. The strafer modifications that had proved so devastatingly effective at Bismarck Sea needed to be implemented at the factory. North American Aviation's engineers had declared the modifications unflyable. General Kenny needed Gunn in California to show them they were wrong. Gunn arrived at North American Aviation's plant in Kansas City to find the same engineers who had dismissed his modifications now tasked with implementing them. The meeting was brief and pointed. Gunn explained what he had done in a Brisbane hangar with hand tools and scavenged parts. The engineers took notes. The B-25G variant, incorporating factory-built strafer noses, entered production within months. The B-25H followed, mounting even heavier armament. By war's end, North American Aviation had produced more than 1,000 strafer-configured Mitchells, all descended directly from Gunn's field modifications. The impact on Pacific operations was immediate and sustained. The 345th Bomb Group, known as the Air Apaches, converted to the strafer role in August 1943. Over the next 26 months, they flew more than 10,000 combat sorties. They sank 260 Japanese vessels and damaged 275 others. They destroyed 260 Japanese aircraft on the ground and shot down 107 more in aerial combat. The group received 4 distinguished unit citations. 712 men were lost, 580 killed on missions. But the Japanese losses were orders of magnitude greater. The 345th was not unique, Multiple bomb groups across the Pacific converted to Strafer operations. The technique spread to Marine Corps PBJ squadrons, which flew modified Mitchells from bases in the Philippines, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa during the war's final months. Their primary mission was interdicting Japanese shipping, attempting to run the blockade that was strangling Japan's home islands. The weapon of choice became the 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket, 8 of which could be carried and fired in devastating salvos. Japanese naval reports grew increasingly desperate. One admiral admitted that B-25 strafers were more destructive than submarines, more accurate than dive bombers, and more versatile than torpedo planes. The assessment was not hyperbole. While American submarines inflicted the majority of Japanese merchant shipping losses, air power could concentrate rapidly to hammer specific convoys. The B-25 strafer, operating at altitudes below 500 feet, proved nearly impossible to defend against. Fighter interception was difficult because the strafers flew too low and too fast. Heavy anti-aircraft guns designed for high-altitude bombers could not depress far enough to engage. In desperation, some Japanese pilots attempted to ram the bombers, sacrificing their aircraft in hopes of bringing down a single Mitchell. The psychological impact on Japanese convoy operations was permanent. After the Bismarck Sea, large-scale reinforcement convoys through Allied-controlled waters ceased. Future reinforcements came via submarine or small boats operating at night, delivering only fractions of the troops and supplies needed. Japanese garrisons across New Guinea, the Solomons, and the Philippines were left to fight with whatever resources they possessed when Allied forces arrived. Many starved. Many died of disease. Many retreated through jungles where exhaustion and hunger killed as effectively as combat. The inability to protect shipping broke the back of Japan's island defense strategy. General Kenny, in his post-war memoir, wrote that the Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked the moment Allied air power achieved dominance in the Southwest Pacific. The Japanese never recovered. MacArthur's island-hopping campaign, which depended on isolating Japanese garrisons by cutting their supply lines, became viable only after Bismarck Sea demonstrated that no convoy was safe from air attack. Major Gunn returned to the Pacific in mid-1943, resuming his role as Special Projects Officer. He continued flying combat missions throughout the war, earning 2 distinguished flying crosses, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Air Medal, and 9 Purple Hearts. His family remained imprisoned in Manila at Santo Tomas internment camp. The knowledge burned inside him. Every mission he flew was personal. Every Japanese ship sunk brought Allied victory closer. Every Allied victory brought the liberation of the Philippines closer. And the liberation of the Philippines meant the liberation of his wife and children. In October 1944, American forces landed on Leyte in the Philippines. Gunn went ashore with a special battalion of air, corps, maintenance and engineering personnel to establish an airfield at Tacloban. Shortly after the landings, the Japanese aircraft carrier Princeton was sunk. 30 of her aircraft needed an emergency landing site. The Tacloban airfield was partially completed, had no landing lights, and was shrouded in low clouds and drizzling rain. Gunn, the old Navy flyer, improvised. He tied flashlights to the ends of long sticks and acted as a landing signal officer, guiding all 30 Navy aircraft safely to the ground in darkness. His 20 years of carrier experience, earned as an enlisted naval aviation pilot, saved 30 aircrew that night. Days later, a Japanese air raid struck Tacloban airfield. Gunn was caught in the open. A white phosphorus bomb exploded nearby. Fragments buried themselves in his shoulder, causing severe pain and rendering his arm useless. He was evacuated to Australia and spent the remainder of the war in convalescence. When American troops liberated Manila in February 1945, General Douglas MacArthur personally ordered a flying column of the 1st Cavalry Division to liberate Santo Tomas internment camp immediately. Colonel Dave Hutchinson, commander of the 308th Bombardment Wing, went with them to find the Gunn family. 2 weeks later, MacArthur visited the camp and met Gunn's wife and children personally. He arranged for them to be flown to Australia to reunite with the man who had become famous throughout the Pacific during the previous 3 years. The reunion was bittersweet. Gunn's family had survived 3 years of internment, but the experience had left scars. His children had grown up behind barbed wire. His wife had endured conditions that broke many prisoners, and Gunn himself was a changed man. The jovial teller of tall tales remained, but beneath it lay knowledge of what war cost and what personal vengeance required. He had waged his own private war against Japan to free his family. He had succeeded, but the cost was measured in nights spent wondering if they were still alive, in missions flown with fury rather than calculation. In the burden of knowing that every day the war continued was another day his family suffered. Gunn retired from the army as a full colonel on June 30th, 1948, due to physical disability from his wounds. He returned to the Philippines and re-established Philippine Airlines, the airline he had founded before the war. The company expanded rapidly, providing flights across the South Pacific. Gunn remained a pilot. He flew charter missions, ferried aircraft, and operated his airline with the same improvisational genius he had brought to aircraft modification. On October 11, 1957, Colonel Paul Irvin Gunn was flying a charter mission in a Beech Model 18 over the Philippines when he encountered a severe storm. The aircraft crashed. Gunn was killed instantly. He was 57 years old. He was buried at Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida, among the naval aviators with whom he had served 4 decades earlier. His legacy, however, did not die with him. The B-25 Strafer remained in service throughout the Pacific War and continued flying in foreign air forces for decades afterward. The tactics Gunn pioneered, low-altitude strafing combined with skip bombing, became standard doctrine. The principle he demonstrated that overwhelming forward firepower could suppress defenses long enough to deliver ordnance accurately influenced ground attack aircraft design for generations. The Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt, developed in the 1970s, mounted a 30mm GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon capable of firing nearly 4,000 rounds per minute. The aircraft was designed specifically for close air support, attacking ground targets at low altitude with devastating firepower. The designers understood what Pappy gun had proven in 1942, and when attacking defended targets at close range, nothing substitutes for overwhelming fire. Major Ed Larner, who led the B-25 Strafers at Bismarck Sea, survived the war and returned to civilian life. He rarely spoke of the battle. The memory of what those 14 machine guns did to human beings haunted many who flew strafer missions. They understood the strategic necessity. They accepted the tactical reality. But understanding and accepting did not make the memories easier to carry. Larner died in 1983. His obituary mentioned his service, but did not detail the battle that changed naval warfare in the Pacific. The wreck of the SS Pruth, the practice target where crews learned skip bombing, remained on Natiara Reef until the 1960s, when salvage operations removed most of the visible structure. Today, only scattered debris marks the location. Divers occasionally visit the site, unaware that they are swimming above the training ground where a generation of pilots learned to destroy ships at altitudes measured in feet rather than thousands of feet. The Japanese destroyers sunk at Bismarck Sea, Shirayuki, Asashio, Arashio, and Tokitsukaze lie in deep water north of New Guinea. No salvage has been attempted. They remain war graves, monuments to sailors who died defending a convoy against a tactic they could not counter. The 8 transport ships rest nearby, their hulls broken, their cargo and troops lost. More than 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors died in those waters. Most were never recovered. The Bismarck Sea became their cemetery. The Allied aircraft losses at Bismarck Sea totaled 4 planes and 13 aircrew. The exchange ratio was 230 Japanese casualties for every Allied casualty. This was not attrition warfare. This was a fundamental shift in the balance of power, one that the Japanese never corrected. The strategic consequences rippled throughout the Pacific War. Japanese planners, forced to acknowledge that large convoys could not survive in Allied-controlled waters, adopted increasingly desperate measures to resupply isolated garrisons. Submarines delivered supplies in quantities too small to sustain combat operations. Small boats attempted night runs through dangerous waters. Garrisons were ordered to become self-sufficient through local agriculture, an impossible task on many islands. The result was predictable. Japanese forces across New Guinea and the Solomons fought with diminishing resources until they collapsed. The campaign that followed Bismarck Sea, the New Guinea offensive, the Philippines' liberation, the island-hopping strategy toward Japan succeeded because Japanese forces could not be reinforced or resupplied effectively. MacArthur's strategy of bypassing heavily defended islands and allowing them to rot on the vine worked only because air power could prevent resupply. And air power could prevent resupply only because the B-25 Strafer had solved the ship-killing problem that had plagued Allied air forces since Pearl Harbor. The weapon that accomplished this was not sophisticated. It was 14 machine guns bolted to an airframe designed for a different purpose entirely. The innovation was not technological, it was tactical and operational. Pappy Gunn did not invent new weapons. He mounted existing weapons in a configuration that maximized their effectiveness at the ranges where aircraft could attack ships successfully. He combined this firepower with a bombing technique that required courage bordering on insanity, but delivered results that conventional bombing could not match. The Luftwaffe, fighting in the Mediterranean and European theaters, never fully appreciated what the B-25 Strafer represented. German doctrine emphasized specialized aircraft for specialized roles. The Heinkel He 111 torpedo bomber was designed specifically for attacking ships. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber was designed for precision ground attack. The idea of converting a medium bomber into a Strafer by mounting excess machine guns seemed crude, unsophisticated, and wasteful to German engineers committed to elegant solutions. They laughed at American tactics. They dismissed the B-25 modifications as desperate improvisation. They were wrong. American air power in World War II succeeded not through technological superiority, but through operational flexibility. The United States produced aircraft in quantities that allowed experimentation. Commanders like Kenny encouraged innovation from any source, regardless of rank or credentials. Mechanics like Gunn were given resources and authority to solve problems using whatever methods worked. The result was a military culture that valued results over procedures, that rewarded successful improvisation rather than punishing deviation from doctrine. The B-25 Strafer embodied this culture. It was not the aircraft North American Aviation designed. It was not the weapon Army Air Force's doctrine specified. It was the solution that worked when conventional solutions failed. And it worked because one man, frustrated by inefficiency and driven by personal motivation, refused to accept that the problem was unsolvable. That morning in March 1943, when Major Lana's B-25 seconds appeared at wave-top height over the Japanese convoy, the Luftwaffe's assumptions about medium bombers were about to be destroyed, along with 8 transport ships and 4 destroyers. The Japanese sailors who died in the Bismarck Sea never understood what killed them. They trained for high-altitude bombing attacks. They prepared for torpedo runs. They were equipped and positioned to defend against the tactics they knew. What they encountered was something entirely different. 14 machine guns firing simultaneously from an aircraft flying at 200 feet, followed by bombs skipped into their hulls at the waterline. It was brutal, it was effective, and it changed the war. The lesson of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea is not about machine guns or skip bombing. It is about the willingness to abandon doctrine when doctrine fails. It is about trusting practitioners over theorists. It is about understanding that the best solution to an impossible problem is often the simplest one, executed with overwhelming force and absolute commitment. The Japanese convoy steaming toward Leh on March 3, 1943, was considered reasonably safe behind its destroyer escort and fighter cover. 15 minutes later, it was destroyed. The doctrine that protected it was obsolete, and the weapon that obsoleted it was created by a 43-year-old former Navy chief petty officer working in a maintenance hangar with hand tools and scavenged parts. Pappy Gunn died in a storm over the Philippines in 1957. His airline continues to operate today under Philippine Airlines. His innovations remain embedded in ground attack doctrine. His story is largely forgotten outside military aviation circles, but every time a close air support aircraft fires its guns at a ground target, every time overwhelming firepower suppresses enemy defenses long enough for ordnance to be delivered accurately, the ghost of Pappy Gunn's B-25 Strafer is present. The Luftwaffe laughed at the concept. The Japanese convoy learned otherwise, and history recorded the result. 14 50-caliber machine guns erased more than ships that morning. They erased assumptions about what was possible. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.